Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. And this week we have a special episode as we're doing something slightly different than normal. We are actually doing an interview with Siân Esther Powell. Yes. Hey, I got it right. It's funny that I got stuck on the second one all of a sudden. Like, what's that? And you are on the Celtic Myths Podcast. You're the host of that show, correct?
I am indeed. Celtic Myths and Legends. There's another Celtic myth podcast that's very, very, very good, but not quite me.
Not quite the same. Okay. All right. So what I wanted to talk about, to kind of go into detail about, is specific stuff around Welsh legends and myths. We're in the process of, as I mentioned to you in the past, but to the kind of clarify to the group, I guess, who's listening, we're on the cusp of getting into the discussions about Owain Glyndwr and the role he played in the last major Welsh revolt against the English crown. And as part of that, one of the things that keeps coming back to me, and it was really brought up heavily in one of the episodes I just did, is both the fear and the hope that has come out of sources in that era, specifically in the 14th and 13th centuries, around what's perceived by the English and obviously hoped for by the Welsh, that they can eventually defeat the English, that they can overthrow them, and in some respects, even if you go back far enough, throw them back out of Britain, as they perceive them as being interlopers and outsiders and not the true inheritors to Britain. So that's kind of the starting point of this discussion, is because, kind of what's forcing, or what's bringing this up, what sort of, one of the things I brought up in our initial discussion is that you see commonalities in mythology in this period especially, but I would argue it goes back quite a long way of sort of the superhero who's going to be the one that defeats the enemy, whomever the enemy is, be that the Messiah in Old Testament times, or the figures of that nature. And Wales is no different. There appears to at least be three that I can just think of off the top of my head that kind of fit that category. One of which I always pronounce sort of poorly, so we'll see how this goes, is Mason Wedlig, I think is how you say it, and that could be completely wrong. And you have Ambrosius, who is like the one that Gildas wrote about, and then you have Arthur, of course, who is more well known to modern audiences as being a very important figure for sort of myth building. And so that's kind of what I wanted to start with, is kind of talking about these, why is it that when cultures are in these situations, do they develop kind of the attitude of we need a savior to come help us, or some great hero? Is it something specific about kind of the way we hold our hope out, or that kind of thing? So I guess first off, before we get too deep into that weed, though, I just wanted to if you could introduce yourself to the audience, so to speak, and kind of your podcast, so that they kind of know more about it. So I shouldn't get too far into specifics until we do that.
No, I do have an answer for some of those kind of questions, though. I'm Siân. Hello. I'm Siân Esther Powell, as you introduced me. Thank you very much. I'm the host of Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast. Find me on Twitter as well, always tweeting away about local history and heritage and folklore and things like that. Really interested in folklore. So I'm from Cornwall, but my father's Welsh. Most of my family are Welsh. Siân Powell is a very Welsh name. So I'm very interested in Welsh history and mythology as well. But absolutely not a scholar on on this particular topic. So as I said, I will just be kind of winging it in discussions, try my best.
Which is totally fair. I mean, I've never claimed to the audience to really be I'm certainly not an academic in this area, but I do try and do as best as I can to cover the topics as thoroughly as I can. And I know there are times where I don't get to cover as much as I want or be able to read everything I want. So I don't think that's a reason to disclaim your ability or your understanding of the issue. So,
I mean, I'm doing my master's in Celtic studies, so it gives me a sort of a tiny air of credibility, but that's something at least.
Hey, well, it's more than me. I'm just a Bachelor of Arts kind of history major.
Well, I haven't finished the master's yet, so we'll see.
Fair enough. Okay, so I guess to get back to the original question then, so what are your thoughts on this subject and kind of where you think it might lie?
Well, I think to answer first off, you have to, as you obviously well know, you have to understand that Welsh culture of the time was very much a storytelling culture. You know, you would have bards that would basically be enlisted with, you know, local lords that would tell stories about lineages and genealogies and things like that. So Welsh history has always been tied with storytelling and folk narratives. So it makes sense to me that the Welsh people would kind of plot things neatly into kind of narrative tropes, to have this kind of hero-like leader rise up and liberate from the English, who are seen as some kind of oppressive force. It's very much a kind of fairy tale fantasy storytelling structure. So it makes sense to me when you kind of understand that's where the Welsh people were coming from. They're very much a storytelling people.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's something I think we see in our own literature even today. But I think it's changing by degrees, but I think there's still that sense of, because I often will use examples out of Native American culture, because there's kind of a similar sense of, we were here first, you came here and then took over the place and kind of pushed us off to the side. And I see some relative things in common in that respect. And kind of how those that are sort of put into those categories are kept in places where, you know, like for example, where I live in Canada, the native Canadians around here found themselves put into parts of the country which were less desirable and usually more isolated, specifically because they were out of the way then. And so that the settlers could basically take territory that was much more desirable and obviously going to offer more wealth and more protection. But now, of course, that's led to other interesting factors, as, you know, now that territory is theirs and they have a hard time leaving that area because of their attachment to that area, which is fully understandable. So I kind of look at that and I see some similarities in how specifically the Welsh, I think in some ways, because unlike the Scottish and I guess to a degree the Irish as well, and probably the Cornish, I don't know enough about to be able to speak on, but you know, that layer of sort of domination by one culture and kind of having to deal with it feels kind of like a similar conversation. It isn't, you know, one to one. You can't say, well, this equals that, but there are definitely some times where I kind of see that commonality right up to the old Roman ideas that the peoples that they found here were basically like noble savages, that kind of idea. The very strong sort of concept of that in like Tacitus and people like that, where they're writing about the tribes here, and they basically are in Wales and in Britain in general, and effectively said, you know, the ones that were fighting them the hardest were the noble ones, because they were the ones that were actually not addicted to Roman culture. So it feels a lot like sort of like the Victorian vibe on native cultures as well, kind of in that perspective. But yeah, so because I know you've looked a little bit into them, and I always struggle pronunciation wise on this, but the Mabinogi, is that how you say that? Mabinogian?
The Mabinogion. Well, as I said, you know, it's a storytelling culture in Wales, and not only oral storytelling, but also, you know, written storytelling as well. When you see the Mabinogion, you know, written between, I think, something like the 12th and 14th century, you know, that's the kind of estimated time for it, where the manuscript was found. But you have lots and lots of heroes in Welsh myths and legends. Lots of heroes from noble families. They're always kind of from noble families. And that's who Owen Glyndŵr was as well. You know, he was from landed gentry. So there is a kind of parallel. He fits perfectly with this idea of romanticized kind of nationalism. I think when you have movements like, you know, the Welsh uprising and all this, you need a good figurehead, and he was the perfect figurehead for it. You know, he was, you know, very well educated man. You know, he was from the borderlands between England and Wales, as you well know, I'm sure. So he was very able to kind of work in English and Welsh society. But in Welsh society, it was very much, he was descended from the hereditary princes of Wales. So there is this idea in Wales that genealogy and hereditary, it means something, you know, tracing families back. So, for example, my name, Powell, actually is Ap Howell, son of Howell. So this idea of son of, child of, is really important in Welsh culture and history when you look back. So he's first descended from a long line of Welsh princes. So that kind of gives it this kind of mythic air itself anyway.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the one thing I would describe is at the same point, within probably, I'd say 100 years of that as well, maybe 200, ideas that are being formed around the same time as all of this literature is being written down or collected, because you can argue that some of it was collected from much older verbal stories. You have what I would argue is a formalization of the Arthur character from being a member, just a leader of a war band, to somehow being a nobility figure. Like he kind of merges into that degree. And I don't know whether it's something that's come, you know, I think if I remember correctly, I know Geoffrey of Monmouth is partially to blame for some of this. But I don't know if he's the one who actually makes him a king. It feels like that was more of a French invention later, but I'm not sure. I can't remember well enough whether he said he was King Arthur at that point. I think he did, though, because I thought that he was the one who kind of came up with the idea of the round table, Guinevere, and all that stuff.
I'm biased, you know, I'm Welsh, but I'm also Cornish, and we Cornish have lots of our own King Arthur origin stories of our own.
The problem is what we've got. Of stuff that's coming out of earlier centuries where there's mention of this figure, but it's not clear where the figure's from. Even his name isn't necessarily accurate, I think, because all we have is these references, like "you're not as good as Arthur." That's one of the earliest references we have, and then the one in the in Nennius's documents talking about Arthur's achievements at various battles. But that was kind of it until you get to the Geoffrey Monmouth character writing all the ideas he had, and kind of that concept of Arthur as, is he from the Old North? Is he from Wales? Is he from Cornwall? Or is he from somewhere else? Or did he exist at all? That's where this whole thing comes from. And in my mind, in some ways, that's where I see Owain, and we'll talk much more about this on the podcast as we go through it, but I think that's kind of where Owain gets kind of cluttered into that idea. Even though he's not the same, he's still a very successful individual who comes, like you say, from nobility. So is it the nobility factor? Is this concept that they have to be someone noble to be heroic? Is that something that we see often in these kind of stories, or is that just something that's sort of come about and we just associate it with each other?
You do often see them coming from nobility. You do often see them coming from powerful families, or at least from powerful lineage. At least if they're not from the most wealthy or the most powerful families at the time, they are at least just descended from someone that once was. I'd also just like to shout out Geoffrey of Monmouth, because he really just tried his best, didn't he? I love History of the Kings of Britain. It's a brilliant read, but most of it's quite fanciful and very mythical. But I love it. A very ambitious book.
Yeah, for sure. It feels like basically he went, all you English people running around saying how wonderful your history is. Well, here's a history. And he just kind of took liberties whenever it felt good.
It does kind of feel like that. And you have to, you have to understand as well that King Arthur is very much like a legendary ruler, a legendary leader. But his whole figurehead was that his whole stance was that he was defending against Saxon invaders, so he was the leader of Britain. And in Welsh, calling back to your kind of point earlier as well about why we do see this narrative pop up in Wales again and again about like a messiah type figure, and about being like the earliest Britons, is that it is a deep-seated kind of Welsh belief that the Welsh are the first Britons, more so than Saxons and Normans and Vikings or whoever is invaded the British Isles. It's a deep-seated kind of belief that the Welsh are the first Britons, and are connected to the Cornish in that way, are connected to the Bretons over in France. I think at the time, actually, of Owain Glyndwr's revolt, I think that Brittany was still an independent kingdom at that point. So I think he did have the help of the French and of the Bretons. So it's interesting to see that there was that connection between Wales and the Bretons. Even then, there was that kind of romanticized, like nationalist connection between them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of see how that kind of perspective still, I think, revolves into today's culture and today's politics and today's history, to the point where I remember not long back the BBC publishing a document talking about DNA and saying that the oldest DNA in Britain is actually in North and Southwest Wales, and how excited people were about that. And you only have to realize how isolated they were as to explain that, but it's kind of funny to sort of see. And I'm no different than anybody else. My ancestors come from North Wales, so you're kind of like, oh yeah. so it's a silly thing to get excited about, but you do kind of think, oh well, that makes me a little bit more something than someone else, even though that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But certainly there is a sense of pride I've noticed coming out of those kind of things. That old idea about that, and yet at the same time being open and welcoming to anybody. Not to say that isn't. Well,
it's actually it's stronger now. That if anything, this idea of kind of pride, is stronger now. And I run a podcast, Celtic Myths and Legends, where I talk about the 6 Celtic nations, and it's not through kind of nationalism I'm doing it, and actually. It is a little bit false to kind of claim these places are really similar, because it's only in retrospect that we've looked back at kind of ancient Iron Age Celtic tribes and said, oh, they're quite similar. And then, through history have gone, oh, they're quite similar as well. So it was nice for me to kind of realise that Breton and Wales had that connection before, because really I just see this kind of Celtic revival now being very strong now, but actually doesn't really have that much historical credibility. I think there's a real need for people as well to feel part of a community in some way, for various factors. I'm not only going to blame the internet or whatever, but we're finding ourselves increasingly isolated. So I think there's a real resurgence now in history and heritage and culture and folklore, and how that sort of translates to land and landscape. But I guess also, as you said, also DNA. You know, I'm personally not very interested in genetics and DNA, but that's easy for me to say. You know, I have, you know, personally been born on a land and lived on a land that's very steeped in folklore and history. So my connection is very much to the landscape and to that folklore and history, whereas I know that's not the same for people that live outside of where their grandparents or their parents have come from. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I think and everybody's different. I mean, I would argue that, like, my father didn't care about anything to do with his previous, you know, his ancestry's background. So it's not like it's a common thing, but I think there is, to some extent, a strong sort of sense of understanding where you've come from that comes out of, especially I think if you've come from somewhere else and at some point in your history, be it, you know, your grandparents or great grandparents or whatever, you do have sort of an interest in knowing kind of where that's come from. And I think that does lead into it. I think for me, the biggest thing I've noticed is that there's a false narrative, which I kind of fight against a bit with the podcast, which is that there was this national understanding of what a Welshman was or what a Briton was going back into the earliest points when the various kingdoms took off at the end of the Roman period. And you have to kind of convince people that it's the perception at that point was not, hey, we're one nation. It was more, we're a bunch of individual kingdoms, and we don't necessarily look at the other kingdoms as being the same or necessarily are equal or even brother or sister or whatever.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, so there's not the sense of nationalism the way we think of it. And that's one of the things I think people misunderstand, is that, you know, if you came from Gwynedd, you didn't necessarily think of yourself as Welsh. You thought of yourself as if you thought of yourself of anything, you know, you're a subject of the king of Gwynedd, and that was about it. So I think the language commonalities are one thing, but I think when we think that there was more to it, I don't think that comes until after the conquest.
No, I certainly agree with you to a large extent, really. It's kind of ludicrous to kind of have this idea of, oh yes, you know, there was always, I'm English, I'm Welsh, and when the Kingdom of Wales was divided up into various lands and kingdoms, you know, the Kingdom of England wasn't England, it was all these other parcels of land with various names, you know. And as I was saying earlier, bards were connected to various lords, so they would tell the history and genealogy of that lord, and then that lord's kingdoms and petty kingdoms and things like that. So your loyalty was really to the piece of land that you were from, which lord looked after your land. It wasn't stretching back, you know, far to the Romans and saying, oh yes, we Welsh, we've always been, you know, stepped on. There wasn't that nationalistic idea of it, because there wasn't one nation to be nationalistic of.
Yeah, and I think that's where we struggle, because we have very strong nation states that have very formulated ideas about what that is.
I think it's easy to get confused just because of the language commonality, as you said, because, you know, you have the Welsh language. There was a Welsh identity, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't how we imagine it to be or how it is today. You know, it was just that there was a common language read and spoken.
Yeah, and especially in the medieval period, where you have allegiances to lords and to local nobility, you may not even consider the king as being a ruler that you have to deal with, other than in sort of a nebulous fashion. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast. We'll be back with more from Sean in the next episode. Until then, everyone, take care. If you want to contact me, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, on Twitter at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Any questions, comments, or concerns, be sure to reach out to me. And until next time, everyone, take care. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production, and for everything we do, check out distractionsmedia.com.
Whether it's missing flights or retirements out of the blue, whether it's resignations or bans, as the old saying goes, there's never a quiet day in West Indies cricket. So make sure you listen to West Indies on 99.94 to stay up to date with all the latest fallout with the teams in maroon.